For 70 years she wore the crown and kept the country together through wars, scandals, and storms. She never told anyone about the son, neither Parliament, her own family, nor even the man himself until he was 66 years old. That's when a royal guard found something he wasn't supposed to see. A name. A sealed birth record from 1958, a boy hidden by silence and buried by the crown. When he gave it to Prince William, the royal family had to decide whether to keep it a secret or ultimately tell the truth. Before we show you the moment Edward Hale learned his mother was the Queen, make sure you're subscribed with the bell icon turned on, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what you're about to witness was never meant to be part of history, but the guard made sure it was. There was a rhythm to Buckingham Palace. It wasn't loud or easy to see, but for those who stood guard long enough, the rhythm became second nature. Sergeant Alistair Greaves knew it better than most. He stood alone in the east corner of the marble hall, rifle by his side, and his ceremonial uniform was perfect, right down to the fold of his gloves. He had been with the Coldstream Guards for 22 years, was a veteran of Helmand Province, and was fluent in silence. His peripheral vision, which he had trained through hostile patrols where movement meant survival, caught something strange just after midnight. Someone, an aide, not a guest or a senior royal, was moving too swiftly. He walked into the Queen's gallery with a leather-bound document case, one of the antique transit bags used for very private files. But the speed wasn't what stopped Greaves. The seal on the flap, not the royal cipher used by Charles, was what made it stand out. It was older, with a style that looked like it had been carved into the leather. This style hasn't been utilized since the late Queen's early reign in the 1950s. Greaves's eyes got smaller. There had been no word concerning archival transfers, and the North Library Annex, where the aide was going, was closed for renovations. He followed his gut. This wasn't a drift in protocol. This was an illegal relocation of a file that hadn't been seen in decades. Greaves turned his post a little bit, just enough to avoid drawing notice, but not enough to move himself close to the corridor junction. 5 minutes went by. 10. Then the aide came back, this time without anything, and his jacket looked better than before. Greaves took a deep breath, and then turned to face the annex. He wouldn't accept anything. He wouldn't get involved. But he had seen enough in his life to know how heavy buried truths are. He could feel in his bones that whatever had been taken into that chamber hadn't come back out. He waited till the hall was empty. Then he passed the threshold without making a sound, like the stone under his boots. The extension to the North Library smelled like thyme and glue. Greaves walked softly across the antique parquet floor. The desk in the back appeared fine, but the chair was off by 2 inches, and the left drawer was locked. He grabbed for the drawer in the upper right corner and opened it slowly. A brown leather folio that was antique, hand-stitched, and had a faded but clear gold seal on it. He didn't open it right away. He just looked, taking in the way the leather split a little at the corners, and the way the flap bent as if it had been closed too many times. Greaves was aware of the rules. Guards were not allowed to view crown documents, especially those that weren't theirs. But this wasn't just idle curiosity. He did this out of instinct, and instinct had kept him alive in areas where rules didn't matter. He drew the folder toward him, opened it slowly, and looked over the first page. Edward Montfort, Private Heir Inquiry, 1959. He blinked. The name didn't signify anything to anyone, not even the royals or the palace registry. There was never a Montfort in line for the throne. He turned to the next page, which was about recontingency placement wardship, and said to go to the Foreign Office in 1960. It was written on royal stationery and signed by Sir John Ashbury, Elizabeth's first private secretary, not a royal. Then there was another sheet with a sealed birth document from December 1958. The mother's name was Elizabeth A., and the father's name was blacked out. Graves's palm froze, and his heart raced once, like a gun going off next to his ear. He slowly and carefully closed the folder, like you would a door you know you're not supposed to open. This wasn't a letter between diplomats. It wasn't a rule. It was a secret bloodline that no history book, TV biography, or royal archive exposed to the press had ever written about. A boy, not a relationship, not a rumor, a child who was properly documented, sealed and buried. Graves put the folder back where he found it, fixed the drawer, and straightened the chair. He didn't leave any evidence, but his mind was already racing, going over what this meant, what it could mean, and what it would mean if someone else found it before. He couldn't prove it yet, but if what he just saw was real, and the late Queen had a son that no one knew about, then someone had just found a time bomb. Sergeant Alistair Graves had just read the countdown. He strode down the hall back to the guards' quarters with his jaw set. On the outside, calm. Inside, the weight of what he'd witnessed felt like a sack that was too heavy to carry. He was sitting on the edge of his bunk with his gloves folded next to him and his uniform still on. He looked at the distant wall, where a faded picture of Elizabeth still hung. Was it treason to stay quiet, or treason to talk? He pondered of the dead queen. He had kept an eye on her in Windsor during storms that knocked out power for hours. He was in line at the mall for her last procession, and the rain was pouring into his eyes. Could she have kept a child a secret? He wanted to say it was a fabrication, but the paper and the cipher seemed too real. It wasn't easy to fake Sir John Ashbury's signature. Reported up the chain, but a palace aide would bury it, a secretary would burn it. Even Charles was known for keeping quiet when it was easier than causing a scandal. It had to go to someone clean, someone who embodied the future, not the past. William, the prince. Graves let out a breath, and the choice became as firm as cement that had been poured and hardened. He would take the chance. He would ask for a private audience, which a guard would never do. He would breach years of silence, since in this case, silence meant treachery. He was aware of the cost. The request itself might end his job. They may take away his rank, force him to retire early, fire him for being unfit, unstable, or even worse, crazy. But the other option, to stand motionless and watch the crown hide blood, wasn't appropriate for it to erase. He leaned back against the bunk, stiffened his jaw, and unbuttoned the top button of his tunic. I couldn't fall asleep. Duty didn't let that happen very often. But the choice had already been made in the dark. He would have things going by morning. His quiet would no longer be an option, no matter what occurred after that. It wasn't normal for a Coldstream guard to ask to see a senior royal. It was almost impossible to imagine. There were no written rules for the procedure, but everyone knew what they were. People should have seen guards, not heard them. They stood up. They kept safe. They did as they were told. But the morning after he found out, Sergeant Alistair Graves did something no one had done in a long time. He went around his boss and sent a handwritten note to the Royal Household Liaison Office. It said, requesting private audience. Matter Crown Preservation. Sergeant A. Graves, Coldstream Regiment. He thought there would be silence, maybe a scolding, or maybe a discreet transfer to a faraway location where no one would ask questions. He didn't expect the response that came just 3 hours later, delivered by a junior steward who looked like he had been taught not to make eye contact. His Royal Highness will see you at 1800. Graves came early in full ceremonial dress, with boots that shone like mirrors. The servant who brought him to Clarence House didn't say anything. He merely opened the doors to a private study and disappeared. Prince William stood at the window with his sleeves pushed up just over his wrists. He wasn't wearing a tie or a press-on. He was just a man in the weightless silence of monarchy, watching the sun set over St. James's Park, like a blanket being pulled over the city. Sergeant Graves said. His voice was friendly but calm, the kind of tone that doesn't make people feel at ease. I've been told this is strange. Graves stood still. Yes, sir. I wouldn't be here if it weren't. William pointed to a chair across from the desk. Talk freely. Graves didn't sit down. He stood up straight, with his shoulders squared. Last night, I stopped the movement of a document that was sealed with your grandmother's code. The aide who brought it put it in a locked drawer in the North Annex. I looked at it for a short time, sir. William lifted an eyebrow. You went against the rules. Yes, sir. No excuse, just fact. Graves took a breath. The file is about a person named Edward Montfort, who was born in It has sealed birth documents, and the mother is listed as Elizabeth A. The quiet in the room became real. It wasn't simply the lack of sound. There was something heavier, like the air itself had gotten thicker. William looked at him. You're saying that my grandmother had another child? I'm not suggesting, sir. I'm telling you. Where is the file now? Still in the drawer. I didn't touch it. But the seal, the binding, and the signatory, Sir John Ashbury's name was on the letter. I know it. William walked a few paces, put his fingers together on his lips, and narrowed his eyes as he thought. And you didn't tell anyone else? No, sir. I came straight to you. Why? Graves' voice was calm and strong. Because your record is clean, and because the monarchy's strength lies in the truth it is willing to carry, not just the pageantry it performs. That made William pause in his tracks. He no longer saw Graves as a soldier, but as something more dangerous, a witness. William finally nodded, slowly and with purpose. You won't tell anyone about this, not your commander, not your fellow guards, not anyone, but you will be available. I might call on you again. Yes, sir. You've already risked your job. Why not go even further? Graves didn't even flinch. Sir, the crown may rest on silence, but it lives on truth." He then turned and walked away, leaving behind a prince who, for the first time in years, wasn't completely confident of the earth beneath him. It was 3 days. Sergeant Alistair Greaves stayed at his post and didn't say anything. There had been no news from Clarence House, no call, no follow-up, and for all he knew, the issue had been put to rest as gently as the file that started it. Then, out of nowhere, a page in formal livery showed up just before evening exercise. It was a single envelope, with gold trim and no insignia. There was a note in Prince William's own handwriting that said, 080 Quo, South Terrace Conservatory. Bring no one. Say nothing. Greaves got there just on time. The conservatory was closed to the public because the glass panes were fogged up by dew in the early morning. The doors opened without a sound, and there were not just Prince William and Princess Anne. She turned to face him as he walked in, her face unreadable. "You are the soldier who has the guts to read what others won't." Greaves didn't say anything. He didn't have to. William gave him a nod. "What did you bring up?" "My aunt had heard before. Fragment whispers. We're trying to figure out if they were just rumors or something more." Anne went forward, her voice low and short. "There was a woman named Lady Morwenna Hyde who worked at court for your grandmother in the late 1950s. She suddenly disappeared, took medical leave, and was never seen at court again. People said she had been sent away and taken something with her." Greaves didn't say anything, but he thought about what that meant. Anne looked at him. "Did the file mention her? What did you see?" Greaves thought about it again. "Not a name, just the note. Wardship redirected via Foreign Office, 1960. William went to the window and looked out at the trees that were naked. "This changes everything, not for the line of succession, but for the crown's integrity." Anne crossed her arms. "William, there's no protocol for this. There's no rulebook that tells you how to confirm a ghost in the bloodline." William looked at Greaves. "You said you didn't touch the file." "Yes, sir. But you do remember the name, Edward Montfort." William stopped, softly clicking boots on tile. "If he's real, he's been living with this silence his whole life. If he's alive, he's in his 60s. Anne's voice came in. "Now the question is, do we bury it again, or do we look for him?" Greaves finally said something. "I can look quietly, so I don't draw the wrong eyes." William lifted an eyebrow. "You're a guard, not a detective." Greaves didn't move a muscle. "I've been able to tell what the enemy is up to from a quarter-mile away, through smoke and dust for years. I can follow a trail." Anne nodded. "He's right. If this becomes official, it will spiral. Staff talk. The press smells blood. We can't let this get out." William hesitated for just a bit longer, his eyes fixed on Greaves as if he were weighing the burden he was going to put on him. "Find him, and make sure we know what we're dealing with." Greaves nodded once. "Yes, sir." Anne said one last thing as he was leaving. "If this is true, the House of Windsor should say sorry to someone, even though it's 70 years late." And just like that, the hunt for the Queen's hidden son started. There was no royal order or MI5 briefing. Instead, a Coldstream guard in shiny boots and stillness in his step walked back into the darkness to chase history. The palace didn't have a department for this kind of thing. There was no button to push when someone needed to find a missing heir. There was no formal work to find a secret that had been hidden for 7 decades on purpose. Sergeant Alistair Greaves didn't require a department, though. He needs time and discipline. He started out in the Royal Navy. Edward Montfort would have been born in late 1958, if the information was correct. That meant he was about 66 years old now, which was the perfect age to join the military during the Cold War. And while the aristocracy regularly joined ceremonial battalions, concealed children would have been sent somewhere less conspicuous, more useful, and somewhere they could blend in with the routine. He pulled threads silently, cross-referencing Navy officer commissions from the 1970s, focusing on individuals who had enrolled under partial scholarship or with undisclosed benefactors, the kind of imprecise phrase used when someone wished to support something without being known. One name came up, Edward Hale, a former lieutenant commander. He had no press background or family tree, but ancient Ministry of Defense documents show that he got an unmarked bursary from a trust registered under a shell company that was connected to the Duchy of Lancaster. Greaves followed the track like he used to follow footsteps in the dust of Afghanistan, slowly, patiently, and with confidence. The trust fell apart in 1981, when after Hale turned 20, most crown-linked payments stopped at 23. After that, Edward's life became regular for a retired sailor. He got a low teaching job at a maritime academy and moved into a little flat on the outskirts of Dorset, distant from palaces, the press, and etiquette. But one thing stuck out. His original birth certificate, which had been lodged in a restricted borough hospital, had been sealed by the government and only briefly opened for the Naval Commission Board before being sealed again. Graves asked an old buddy who now works in the National Archives clerical rotation for a favor. There was no digital request and no paper record, just a quiet visit over tea in a back office that no one paid attention to. Graves didn't even open the file when it was put in front of him. He only looked at the label. Name, Montfort Edward. On December 27, 1958, they were born. Mother, Elizabeth A. Father, not given. Placement, Wardsborough Cottage. Under the care of the Foreign Office from 1960 until 1970. No controversy, no money. A boy just shuffled off the board, hidden in plain sight, reared by strangers, and shielded by quiet. That was intended to last forever. Graves went back to the palace with his notes in his head. He only had the name and an old naval photo of the man he uncovered. No copies or scans. The faint beat of a life that was meant to be buried. Graves added, "His name now is Edward Hale," and he reported directly to Prince William. "She lives alone, is retired, never married, and doesn't make any public claims, but the paper trail is real, and it ends with your grandmother." William took this in without saying a word, peering at the wall in the distance as if he could see through it to the past. Does he know who he is then? Graves stopped. I think he's always had a hunch. William turned to the window and put his hands behind his back. Then we should let him know for sure. The invitation didn't come on royal paper. It was a handwritten note that was put in a plain white envelope and sent by courier to a little flat on the coast of Dorset. The letter had no crest or signature, only a basic sentence scrawled on plain paper. "Mr. Hay, we need to talk about some personal history. Please come to the address below on Thursday at 2 p.m. Transportation will be arranged." Edward Hale almost didn't make it. He had a tranquil life. He served in the Navy, taught, read books, and walked by the sea, where the wind tasted like salt and recollection. He had long since stopped thinking about the peculiar holes in his past, the sealed records, the random scholarship deposits that came without explanation, and the fact that some officials always appeared to know more about him than they should. But something in him, something old and unfinished, told him this was different. So he left. The meeting didn't happen at the palace. It happened at Birk Hall, a private estate in Scotland that people like because it's far away from nosy people. Edward got out of the car and saw 3 persons waiting on the gravel drive: Prince William, Princess Anne, and Sergeant Alistair Graves, the guy who had found him. A solitary uniformed staff member stood by and said nothing. There was no press or fuss, just the wind blowing through the pine trees and the weight of something long buried coming to the surface. Edward walked right inside the modest drawing room. He didn't bend down. He didn't seem frightened. He just seemed like a man who was seeing history change around him and trying to figure out where he fit in. William nodded. "Mr. Hale, thanks for arriving." Edward sat down. His voice was quiet but steady, the type of calm that comes with not expecting replies for years. "I think I already know why." Anne looked at him closely, her face serious but not cruel. "How long have you had your suspicions?" Edward gazed back and forth between them, his hands lying flat on his knees. "Since I was a kid, people who weren't my blood reared me, and no one ever informed me where I came from. I'd ask questions, and they'd stop talking. Not enough noise. Silence is its own answer." Graves stood in the corner, watching as always and not saying anything. But as Edward talked, his stance changed just a little. William opened a leather folder. It wasn't the original, but a clean copy of what had been found. He pushed it across the table to Edward without saying a word. The birth record, the wardship order, and a faded picture of a newborn baby wrapped in royal linen, with the baby's face barely visible under the blanket, were all within. Edward read it without saying a word. His fingers didn't shake, and his posture didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. It was like the strain of a lifetime suddenly letting go, like a knot that had been twisted too tight for too long. Anne spoke up. "Your mother was already queen at 28. The crown couldn't afford any trouble. She didn't make the decision on her own, but she did agree to it." Edward nodded once, slowly and with purpose. "I never wanted to be king, just the truth." William put his hands together. "You'll never be shown off. Your name will go into the royal archive, but you won't have to face the press. Quietly, forever." Edward stared at the picture again, and ran one finger over the edge. "That's all I ever wanted." And in that modest, ordinary room, far from the eyes of the world, a son the monarchy had never acknowledged was finally seen. The intimate conference in Scotland had come to an end. But in London, a new one had just started. A closed-door meeting was set up at Buckingham Palace, within 48 hours of Edward Hale's secret departure. No personnel, no stewards, no assistants with clipboards or courtiers with queries. King Charles, Princess Anne, Prince William, and Sergeant Alistair Graves were the only ones who could go in. They gathered in the king's private writing room, which was older than most kings and had dark wood walls that absorbed light. The crown didn't take these meetings lightly, but this wasn't a matter of ceremony. This was about bloodlines, legacies, and making things right. Charles stood beside the hearth with his hands behind his back. He didn't turn when the others came in. Instead, he just peered into the dark hearth, as if the answers may be lurking in the cold ash. William was the first to say something. "We found him." Nothing. Then Charles turned slowly, like someone who was carrying something heavy that he hadn't planned to lift. His face was drawn, not because he was old, but because he knew who she was. Anne didn't wait. "His name is Edward Hale. He is a retired naval officer who lives simply, has no title and no plans, but he is her son." Charles closed his eyes for a while and let out a breath through his nose. "I remember the murmurs from when I was still young enough to not know the reality. Someone told me not to ask about a name, and then a file was relocated and sealed for good." William moved forward. He never wanted the crown. He doesn't want to be in the spotlight, but the record is out there and we've seen it. He should be recognized quietly, formally, and with dignity. Charles gave him a harsh glance. "Do you know what that does to how people see things? To stability?" Anne cut in, her voice flat and firm. "Perception is already broken. You can't heal a broken bone by painting over it. You hold it up with the truth." Charles walked back and forth once before stopping in front of Grafts. "And you made this clear." Grafts stood still. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Why?" "Because the crown shouldn't be afraid of what it hides more than what it shows." Charles let out a long, leisurely breath, like air coming out of a flat tire. "You put everything on the line for a name that no one remembers." Grafts didn't move. "I remember, sir. And that's all." There was a long silence in the room, the kind that makes you feel like winter is coming through the floors. Charles then went to the desk, opened a drawer, and took out a single parchment folder that was already ready, as if he had known this moment would come. "I had the archivists get this ready. A lineage supplement that isn't numbered, isn't part of the succession, but is still in the house." He put it on the desk and turned to William. "If we do this, it won't be a coronation. It turns into a confession." William's voice was steady and calm. "Then let history write it that way." Charles sat down in the chair, pen in hand. "Very well. This is to say that Edward Montfort, sometimes known as Edward Hale, was born to Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor, and is now recognized by her son." He put his name on it. There was no anthem. There was no trumpet sound. But for the first time in 70 years, the silence in the palace wasn't hiding anything. It was a way to honor it. The throne room, picture gallery, or gilded antechambers that lined the ceremonial wing were not the rooms chosen for the entry ceremony. It was the chamber of records, tucked away behind a paneled hallway under the grand staircase. It was a peaceful place where royal documents were signed, filed away, and kept out of sight. No press, no heralds, just 4 people and 1 piece of paper. Edward Hale came by himself. He had on a plain navy jacket that had just been pressed, and a white shirt underneath. No medals, no ribbons, and no uniform. A man got ready not for a show, but for an end. He walked carefully into the room, his eyes adjusting to the golden light from the lamp that streamed over the old wood and stone. King Charles sat at the end of the long table, looking tired yet determined. Princess Anne was on his right, with her hands neatly clasped in front of her. To the left, Prince William stood up straight with a blank look on his face. Sergeant Alistair Graves stood behind them, completely still and dressed in full ceremonial dress. When Edward got closer, Greaves didn't move, but their eyes connected for a brief moment. In that moment, everything went between them, the search, the quiet, and the revelation that neither of them had anticipated to have to carry. A royal clerk moved up with a thin folder tied with a burgundy ribbon. His voice sounded flat but definitive, the kind of tone that doesn't make you want to ask questions. "The following record must be sealed under Section 7 of the Royal Archives Act and kept in the non-succession lineage annex forever." The king was given the folder. Charles opened it, read the last paragraph again, and then signed it with a silver pen that had his initials on it. The paper said plainly, "Edward Montfort, who is also known as Edward Hale, was born on December 27, 1958, to Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor. He will be formally recognized as a direct bloodline member of the House of Windsor, but he will not be able to inherit the throne. Not a title, not power, just fixing history. Edward got the pen from the clerk. He stopped for a while, then signed his signature under the king's name. His signature was steady and methodical, the kind of handwriting that comes from a life spent producing reports that no one would read, but that yet had to be perfect. "I never wanted to cause any trouble," he murmured softly, looking at everyone and no one at the same time. "I didn't want to be forgotten, but I also didn't want to be erased." Charles nodded. "You won't be." William talked in a lower voice. "Your existence doesn't make the crown weaker. It makes it clearer." Anne turned to Greaves. "None of this would have come out if it weren't for the guard." Edward turned to look at the man who had searched through archives in quiet for a name. "Why did you go after this? You didn't even know who I was." Greaves didn't move, because sometimes the truth isn't about who wants it, it's about who is worthy of it. Edward nodded slowly and firmly, as if that answer had put something to rest in him that nothing else could. The signing was finished. Camilla wasn't there. No one said anything about her absence, but it was still there, a quiet sign of the damage this revelation had done, the way the crown had split between those who wanted to know the truth and those who wanted to feel safe. Greaves stepped next to Edward as they left the room. Nobody said anything. There was nothing more to say. But when the doors closed behind them, the crown, despite all its shadows and ceremony, was one step closer to being honest. And somewhere in the archives, a file that had been hidden for 70 years finally found its home. Not in the dark, but in the record. Should the monarchy have told the public about the Queen's secret son? Or should they have kept his presence a secret to keep things stable? Do you think that Edward Montfort, or Edward Hale as he is known, should have gotten a royal title, or was just being recognized enough? Please tell us what you think in the comments below. We read each and every one. Hit the like button right now if you think the truth should never be hidden. And if you want to know about everything that happens beyond palace walls, make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell icon. Send this video to someone who still thinks royal guards simply stand and salute. They might be the only ones who know the reality. Another surprise is already on its way. See you tomorrow after you see it. Same time, same place, right here on Guard Legends.